A gunshot cracked through the evening air. Two figures fell as smoke rose from the barrel of a lever-action rifle. The wheat field behind them was already half consumed by flames. No one moved. No one spoke. Let me tell you how it began. The fire had been burning for hours. Arabella Blackwood stood at the edge of her property, watching as her livelihood turned to ash. Her wheat field, everything she had to sell this season, was being destroyed. Two men in Silas Crane's colors worked quickly, pouring oil and setting torches to the dry stalks. "They're burning my crops," Arabella whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "They're burning everything." She clutched the faded photograph of her late husband, Thomas. He'd been gone 6 months now, taken by fever that swept through the territory faster than any wildfire. And now this. Silas Crane had been making offers for her land. Fair offers, he called them. Offers she'd refused. Now her crops were gone. What would be next? "That paper isn't real." A woman's scream pierced the air from across town. Arabella turned, squinting against the smoke. She couldn't make out who it was, but the desperation in that voice was unmistakable. The men in her field didn't seem to notice. They continued their work methodically, as if setting fire to a widow's livelihood was just another day's business. Arabella felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This wasn't just about her land anymore. Something terrible was happening in town. She started walking toward the commotion, her boots crunching on the dirt road. The wind carried the smoke toward her, making her eyes water. She could taste ash on her tongue. The screams grew louder, more frantic. Then came the gunshot. Arabella froze. The two men in her field dropped where they stood. A figure on horseback emerged from the haze, smoke swirling around him like a ghost. He didn't shout. He didn't boast. He just sat there, watching as the flames continued to consume what was left of her wheat. The stranger. That's what people called him when he showed up in towns like hers. A man who appeared when justice was needed most. A man who never stayed long enough to learn his name. A man with a red bandana around his neck that stood out against the gray smoke. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. His rifle still smoked in his hand. He walked toward the burning field, his boots making no sound on the scorched earth. The flames danced in his eyes, but didn't seem to touch him. "What have you done?" Arabella finally found her voice. Though it came out as little more than a whisper, the stranger turned toward her. For a moment, she saw something in his gaze, something that suggested he understood exactly what had been taken from her. Then he looked back at the field, then at the men who had fallen. "Justice has a way of finding its mark," he said, his voice rough but calm. "Sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes it comes too late." Arabella looked from the stranger to her burning field. The smoke stung her eyes, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. Her husband's land, her future, all going up in flames. "Who are you?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. The stranger didn't reply. Instead, he walked toward the men who had set the fire, kneeling beside one of them. He searched their pockets, pulling out a folded piece of paper. When he stood, he held it up, showing it to Arabella. "This belongs to you, I think," he said, his eyes meeting hers again. "The deed to your land." Arabella's breath caught. Her deed. The one Silas Crane had claimed was lost in a fire at the courthouse last month. The one that would prove she owned this land, fair and square. "Where did you find that?" she asked, taking a step forward. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back toward his horse, the deed still in his hand. He mounted in one fluid motion, his eyes never leaving hers. "The fire wasn't about your crops, Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "It was about the paper, the one that proves this land is yours." He paused, as if considering whether to say more. Then he added, "Silas Crane wanted that paper gone. Now he'll want something else gone. You." With that, he spurred his horse and rode away, leaving Arabella alone with her burning field and the deed that might save her or get her killed. The stranger had ridden out of sight, leaving Arabella alone with the deed clutched in her trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if it contained the weight of her entire future. She unfolded it carefully, the worn edges creasing under her fingers. There it was, her name, Arabella Blackwood, officially listed as the owner of the land that had been in her family for 3 generations. This wasn't just any piece of paper. This was the original land deed, signed by the territorial governor himself, when her great-grandfather first settled these parts. It was the document that proved the land belonged to her family, not to Silas Crane or anyone else. Without it, Silas could claim the land as abandoned after the crop failure he'd orchestrated. Arabella walked back toward the smoldering ruins of her wheat field. The acrid smell of burnt crops filled the air, mixing with the dust kicked up by her boots. Each step felt heavier than the last. This land had been in her family since 1865, when her great-grandfather had crossed the plains with nothing but a wagon, a few tools, and dreams of a better life for his children. He'd built the first cabin with his own hands. Her grandfather had expanded it, adding rooms as the family grew. Her father had planted the first orchard, the one that still produced apples each fall. And Thomas, her late husband, had been the one to clear the field for wheat, turning rocky soil into something that could sustain them through the long winters. Now, all of that was gone, or would be if Silas Crane got his way. She looked toward town, where the smoke from her burning field mingled with the dust kicked up by horse traffic. Silas owned most of the businesses on Main Street, the mercantile, the livery, the saloon. He had the sheriff in his pocket, too. Sheriff Tom Weston had been turning a blind eye to Silas's land grabs for years, taking his cut and looking the other way. If Silas got her land, he'd control everything from the river crossing to the northern ridge. He'd graze his cattle where her wheat once grew, and her family would be left with nothing but memories and debt. Arabella folded the deed carefully, placing it in the pocket of her dress. It was her only hope now, the only thing standing between her and complete ruin. She needed to find the stranger, the man who had saved her from losing everything tonight. He knew about the deed. He knew what Silas was capable of, and he'd said something about Silas wanting her gone next. She started walking toward town, her determination growing with each step. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the prairie. By the time she reached the edge of town, darkness had fallen. The street lamps were just beginning to flicker to life, casting dim circles of light on the wooden sidewalks. She stopped outside the saloon, listening to the sounds drifting through the open door, laughter, clinking glasses, the occasional shout. Silas was likely in there, surrounded by his men, celebrating his latest victory. She couldn't go in there, not alone, not without proof. Instead, she turned toward the doctor's office at the other end of town. Doc Elmer had been in town longer than anyone. He'd delivered her father, attended her wedding, and had been there when Thomas died. Maybe he knew what to do. Maybe he could help her find the stranger. The office was dark when she arrived. The sign on the door read, Doc Elmer, in faded letters. She knocked softly, then louder, when there was no answer. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing the doctor himself, his face pale in the lamplight behind him. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice tight with concern. I heard about your field. Is everything all right? Arabella hesitated, then pulled the deed from her pocket. I need your help, Doc. This is the original deed to my land. Silas Crane has been trying to get his hands on it. He burned my crops tonight to make sure I couldn't prove I own the land. Doc Elmer's eyes widened as he took the paper from her hands. He examined it carefully under the light of his desk lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A man found it, a stranger. He stopped the men who set my field on fire and gave this to me. He said Silas wanted it gone, and now he wants me gone too. The doctor's face went pale. You need to hide this, Arabella. Silas will stop at nothing to get it back, and once he has it, you'll have nothing left. Arabella nodded, clutching the deed tighter. I know. That's why I need to find that stranger. He said he knew what Silas was planning. He might know how to stop him. Doc Elmer looked toward the window, as if expecting to see Silas's men lurking in the shadows. The stranger, he's dangerous, Arabella, but he's also the only one who might be able to stand up to Silas. If anyone can help you, it's him. He paused, then added, but you can't stay here tonight. Silas will be looking for you, and for this. Arabella felt a chill run down her spine. Where should I go? The doctor's gaze met hers, his expression grave. There's an old cabin on the north edge of my property. No one goes there anymore. You can hide there tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what to do. Arabella nodded, relief washing over her. Thank you, Doc. I don't know what I'd do without you. Just be careful, Arabella. Silas Crane doesn't give up easily, and he doesn't forgive. With that, the doctor handed her back the deed, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief moment. Then he pointed toward the back door. Go out this way. Stay in the shadows until you reach the cabin, and don't light a fire. Smoke travels farther than you think in this dry air. Arabella slipped out the back door, melting into the darkness as the doctor closed it behind her. She clutched the deed tightly, her only hope for the future held in her hands. The stranger had given her a chance, but she knew it wasn't over yet. Silas Crane would be coming for her next, and she needed to be ready when he did. The stranger moved through the darkness with practiced ease, his horse's hooves making barely a sound on the soft earth. He'd watched from a distance as Arabella slipped into the doctor's back door, his mind racing with possibilities. Silas Crane wouldn't give up that easily. The rancher would be looking for the deed and anyone connected to it. He dismounted 100 yards from the doctor's property, tying his horse to a mesquite tree. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and sage. He moved silently across the open ground, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The doctor's cabin stood alone on the north edge of the property, its windows dark against the starlit sky. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin wisp against the vast prairie sky. The stranger approached cautiously, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. He couldn't risk Arabella panicking if he startled her. He knocked softly on the weathered door, 3 quick taps. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The stranger tried the door and found it unlocked. He pushed it open just enough to slip inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim lamplight. Arabella sat on a wooden stool near the fireplace, her knees drawn up to her chest. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with fear. In her hands, she clutched the deed as if it were a lifeline. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Silas will find you. He'll find both of us." The stranger closed the door quietly behind him, his movements deliberate. He didn't approach her directly, instead stopping a few feet away. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the worry etched around her eyes. This was a woman at the end of her rope, with nowhere left to turn. "I need to know something," he said, his voice low and even. "Where did you last see it?" Arabella looked down at the deed in her hands, her fingers tracing the faded ink. It was in the safe at the courthouse, the one in the clerk's office. Silas claimed it was destroyed in the fire last month, along with all the other records from that year. The stranger nodded slowly. "And before that? Where was it before you took it to the courthouse?" Arabella's brow furrowed as she thought back. "It was in my father's desk. After he died, I found it among his papers. Thomas and I planned to have it updated, put both our names on it. But then he got sick and, well, things happened." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "The last time I saw it before the courthouse was when I put it in my satchel to take into town. I never should have left it in the wagon while I went to the mercantile. That's when Silas's men must have taken it." The stranger studied her face, searching for any hint of deception. There was none, only fear and desperation. He believed her. The deed had been stolen once, replaced with a forgery, and now it had been recovered. But Silas wouldn't stop until he had it back. "Doc Elmer isn't who he seems to be," the stranger said, changing the subject slightly. "There's something about him, something familiar." Arabella looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "Doc Elmer has been in town for 30 years. Everyone knows him." "Not everyone," the stranger replied cryptically. "He's connected to this more than you realize. But that's for another time." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "Silas will come for you tonight. He'll send his best men. They won't stop until they have that deed or until you're gone." Arabella's grip tightened on the deed. "What do I do? I can't fight them. I don't have the means." The stranger shook his head. "You don't have to fight them. But I need to know where Silas keeps his records, his office, his home. There might be something there that proves what he's done." Arabella thought for a moment. "His office is above the mercantile. He has a desk there with a false bottom. That's where he keeps important papers." I saw him open it once when I was delivering some eggs to his wife. The stranger's eyes narrowed. A false bottom? When was this? Last month, Arabella replied, right after the courthouse fire. He was acting strange, kept checking his watch and looking out the window. Then he went to his office and came back with a satisfied look on his face. The stranger nodded slowly. That's where they'll have hidden the original deed, or a copy of it. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Stay here. Don't light any fires. Don't make any noise. If you hear anything, hide in the root cellar under the floorboards. I'll be back. Arabella looked up at him, fear and hope warring in her eyes. Who are you? Why are you helping me? The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the door, paused for a moment, then slipped out into the night. Arabella was left alone with the deed and 1,000 questions. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. The stranger knew what he was doing. He had a plan, and he wasn't going to let Silas Crane win. Outside, the stranger melted back into the shadows, his mind already forming a plan. Silas Crane's office, the false bottom desk, the deed. It was all connected. And tonight, he would expose the truth. The stranger moved through the darkness like a shadow, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden walkway. The mercantile below was closed, but lights still burned in the office above. Silas Crane rarely left his work unfinished. He approached the side door, his hand resting near his pistol. The lock was simple, something a man like Silas wouldn't bother to secure properly. The stranger picked it easily, years of practice making the movement fluid. Inside, the office smelled of cigar smoke and old paper. Books lined the walls, leather-bound volumes that had probably never been read. A large mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers and an inkwell that hadn't been used in days. The stranger ran his fingers along the edge of the desk, feeling for any irregularity. Arabella had mentioned a false bottom, but she hadn't said where. He checked the drawers first, pulling each one out completely, tapping the wood, feeling for anything out of place. Nothing. He moved to the main section of the desk, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings along the front. One section felt slightly different, looser than the rest. He pressed, and a section of the wood gave way with a soft click. A hidden compartment. Inside, nestled among forged documents and land claims with suspiciously similar signatures, lay a stack of papers. The stranger's fingers closed around one particular document, the original deed to Arabella's land, complete with the territorial governor's seal. He was about to take it when voices from below made him freeze. "Mr. Crane won't be happy if he finds you in his office." A man's voice called up the stairs. The stranger slipped the deed into his coat pocket and backed away from the desk. He needed another way out. The window was his best bet. He unlatched it quietly, stepping onto the roof of the mercantile below. The night air was cool against his face as he moved across the slope, heading toward the alley between buildings. Halfway across, a shout came from the street below. "Someone's on the roof! Get him!" The stranger broke into a run, jumping from the roof to the alley below. He landed in a crouch, rolling to absorb the impact, then sprinted toward the darkness at the end of the alley. Shots rang out behind him, bullets whizzing past his head. He didn't look back, just kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get back to Arabella, to warn her that Silas knew the stranger had been in his office. The alley opened onto a dirt road leading out of town. The stranger stopped, catching his breath, listening. No sounds of pursuit. He might have lost them for now, but he had the deed. That was what mattered. As he turned to head back toward the doctor's property, a movement in the shadows caught his eye. A figure emerged from behind a water trough. Tall, thin, with a familiar face. Doc Elmer. The doctor held out his hand. "Give me the deed, stranger. It's not safe with you." The stranger didn't move. "Why would you want it, Doc?" The doctor's eyes darted around nervously. "Silas will tear this town apart to get it back. I'm trying to protect people." The stranger studied the doctor's face, searching for any hint of deception. Everything seemed genuine, but something felt off. Arabella had trusted this man, but the stranger wasn't so sure. "Arabella's in danger," the stranger said finally. "Silas will come for her next." Doc Elmer nodded. "I know. That's why I need the deed. I'll keep it safe." The stranger hesitated, then slowly pulled the deed from his pocket and handed it to the doctor. "If anything happens to her..." The doctor took the deed, his fingers trembling slightly. "Nothing will happen to her, I promise." As the doctor turned to leave, the stranger noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small locket around the doctor's neck, half hidden by his collar. It was old, silver, with a design that looked familiar. Before he could ask about it, the doctor was gone, melting back into the shadows. The stranger stood alone in the moonlight, the deed now in the doctor's hands, and a new question forming in his mind. What had he just done, and who was Doc Elmer really? The stranger stood alone in the moonlight, the deed now in Doc Elmer's hands, and a new question forming in his mind. What had he just done, and who was Doc Elmer really? He turned back toward the doctor's property, his mind racing. The locket. There had been something familiar about it, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. But what? He couldn't place it. As he approached the edge of town, the silence of the night was broken by hoofbeats approaching from behind. He didn't turn around immediately, listening instead. 3 horses, too many for just one rider, and they were moving fast. The stranger quickened his pace, breaking into a jog. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. He could hear the riders now. Low voices, harsh laughter. Silas's men. He ducked into an alley between 2 buildings, pressing himself against the rough wooden wall. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for a single horse to pass. He pulled his pistol from its holster, checking the cylinder. 6 rounds. He hoped it would be enough. The riders entered the alley, their horses' hooves echoing in the confined space. There were 3 of them, big men with rough faces and calloused hands. They wore the same colors as the men who had burned Arabella's field. "Well, well," one of them said, pulling his horse to a stop. "Look what we have here, the man who thinks he can mess with Silas Crane." The stranger didn't answer. He stayed pressed against the wall, his finger on the trigger, waiting for the right moment. "Hand over the deed," another man said, his voice low and dangerous. "And maybe we'll let you walk away." The stranger shook his head slowly. "I don't have it." The third man laughed. "Liar. We saw you with it. Doc Elmer gave it to you, didn't he? Or did you take it by force?" The stranger's mind raced. Doc Elmer had the deed, but these men didn't know that. They thought he still had it. "I don't have any deed," the stranger said, his voice even. "Just trying to mind my own business." The first man spat on the ground. Nobody messes with Silas Crane and gets away with it, especially not some drifter with a red bandana. The stranger saw his chance. As the men dismounted, he moved, his pistol flashing in the dim light. He fired twice, hitting one man in the shoulder and another in the leg. The third man managed to draw his own weapon, but the stranger was faster. A third shot rang out, and the man fell back against the alley wall. The stranger didn't wait to see if they were dead or just wounded. He ran, pushing past the fallen men, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get back to Arabella, to warn her that Silas knew the stranger had been in his office. As he reached the edge of the alley, he heard a shout from behind. "He's getting away! After him!" The stranger broke into a run, sprinting across the open ground toward the doctor's property. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows, but it also made him an easy target. He heard shots whizzing past his head, kicking up dirt at his feet. He reached the doctor's property and dove behind a large mesquite tree, catching his breath. He needed to get to Arabella, to make sure she was safe. But first, he needed to get the deed back from Doc Elmer. Something wasn't right about the doctor, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As he crept toward the cabin, he heard voices from inside. Arabella and Doc Elmer. They were arguing about something. "Can't keep it here," Arabella was saying. "Silas's men will find it." "Don't worry, Arabella," Doc Elmer replied. "I know a place where no one will think to look." The stranger froze. They were talking about the deed. Arabella didn't know that Doc Elmer had already given it to him, and now he didn't have it anymore. Silas's men must have taken it during the ambush. He needed to get inside, to warn Arabella, to find out what was really going on with Doc Elmer. But first, he needed a plan, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. Because now, it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. The stranger crept closer to the cabin, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. He could hear the voices inside clearer now, Arabella's desperate pleas and Doc Elmer's calm but firm responses. "You don't understand, Arabella," the doctor was saying. "This is the only way. Silas will tear this town apart, looking for it. But what if he finds it here? What if he finds us?" Arabella's voice trembled with fear. "We need to give it back to the stranger. He can protect us." There was a pause. Then Doc Elmer sighed. "The stranger. He's in over his head. Silas has too many men, too much power. Running won't solve anything." The stranger reached the window and peeked inside. Arabella sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale in the lamplight. Doc Elmer stood by the fireplace, holding a small leather pouch. The deed, the stranger assumed. "Please, Doc," Arabella begged, "just give it to him. He helped me before. He'll help us now." Doc Elmer shook his head slowly. "No, Arabella. There's something you need to know. Something about me." He walked toward her, his expression grave. "I'm not just the town doctor. I'm your father." Arabella's eyes widened in shock. "What? That's impossible. My father died years ago." "No," Doc Elmer said, his voice soft. "I left when you were just a girl. I couldn't stay. Not after what happened with your mother." The stranger watched through the window, his mind racing. So, that was it. The locket he'd seen earlier. Arabella's mother's, no doubt. The doctor wasn't just a neutral party. He had a personal stake in this. I came back when I heard about Silas, Doc Elmer continued. I knew he was after your land. I've been watching, waiting for the right moment to expose him. Arabella stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Why all the secrecy? I was afraid, the doctor admitted. Afraid if Silas knew who I was, he would come after you, even harder than he already was. He walked to the window and pulled the curtains aside, his eyes meeting the stranger's through the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the stranger stepped back from the window and knocked softly on the door. Doc Elmer opened it, his face pale in the moonlight. I was expecting you, he said quietly. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he looked past the doctor to Arabella, who stood behind him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. We need to talk, the stranger said finally. All of us, and we need to figure out what we're going to do about Silas Crane. The stranger stood at the door of the cabin, looking at Arabella and Doc Elmer. The revelation that the doctor was her father changed everything. But there was no time for more questions. Silas was coming, and they needed to act. We need the deed, the stranger said, his voice low but urgent. And we need to expose Silas at the land registry. Now. Doc Elmer nodded, pulling the leather pouch from his pocket. The worn leather felt familiar in his hands, a reminder of the night he'd taken it from Silas's office. I have it. But how do we get to the registry without Silas's men seeing us? The back way, the stranger replied, his eyes scanning the shadows outside the window, through the alley behind the mercantile. It's how I got in before. Arabella looked from her father to the stranger, fear and determination warring in her eyes. What happens when we get there? The truth comes out, the stranger said simply, one way or another. They moved quickly, slipping out the back door and melting into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and sage. The stranger led them through the narrow alley, his hand resting near his pistol. His eyes scanned the rooftops and doorways, watching for any sign of Silas's men. The town was unnaturally quiet. No roosters crowing, no dogs barking. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. They reached the land registry office just as dawn was breaking. The building was small, with a single window and a door that looked like it hadn't been replaced in 20 years. A faded sign hung above the entrance. Land Registry, Tom Weston, Sheriff. Inside, they could hear voices. Silas and the sheriff. The stranger pressed his ear to the door, catching fragments of their conversation. Can't let this happen, Silas was saying. That deed changes everything. We'll handle it, Sheriff Weston replied. Just like we handled everything else. The stranger stepped back from the door. They're planning something. We need to move now. He pushed the door open, stepping into the office. Silas Crane and Sheriff Tom Weston turned to face them, surprise quickly replaced by annoyance on their faces. Well, well, Silas said, a smirk spreading across his lips. Look what we have here, the busybody cowboy and the little widow. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the deed from Doc Elmer's hands and held it up, The paper felt heavy in his grasp. The ink faded, but clear. "This belongs to Arabella Blackwood, not you." Silas's smirk vanished. "That document is a forgery. The original was destroyed in the courthouse fire." "No," the stranger said, his voice steady. "The original was hidden in your false-bottomed desk, along with several other forged documents." He walked forward, placing the deed on the sheriff's desk. The wood was scratched and worn, with ink stains that had seeped into the grain over years of use. "Check the seal. Check the signature. It's authentic." Sheriff Weston picked up the deed, his fingers trembling slightly as he examined it closely. His face paled as he recognized the territorial governor's signature, the wax seal still intact. This can't be. The original was destroyed." "It can, and it is," the stranger said. "And I have witnesses who can testify to seeing you and Silas conspiring to steal Arabella's land." He gestured to Arabella and Doc Elmer, who had moved to stand beside him. "This is her father. He witnessed the original signing. He can prove this land has been in her family for 3 generations. Silas's face turned red with rage. "You can't prove anything. It's your word against mine." "Not quite," the stranger said, reaching into his pocket. "I have something else." He pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn, the pages inside filled with his neat, precise handwriting. "I've been documenting everything, every threat, every bribe, every forged document, everything." Silas lunged across the desk, but the stranger was faster. He drew his pistol, the movement smooth and practiced. The metal glinted in the early morning light. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The sheriff put his hands up, his face pale. "Easy now. Nobody needs to get hurt." Silas backed away, his face contorted with fury. "This isn't over. You haven't heard the last of me." "Oh, I think we have," the stranger said, his eyes never leaving Silas. "Because the territorial governor is coming next week to inspect the land registry. I've already sent him a copy of everything." Silas's eyes widened in shock. "You wouldn't." "I would," the stranger replied. "And I will. Now, you have 2 choices. You can walk away quietly, or you can face the consequences." Silas looked at the sheriff, who just shook his head slowly. Silas cursed under his breath, then turned and walked out of the office without another word, slamming the door behind him. The stranger lowered his pistol, but didn't holster it. His knuckles were white where he gripped the handle. "Now, about Arabella's land?" The sheriff sighed, picking up a pen from the desk. The nib scratched against the paper as he began filling out the forms. "I'll process the deed immediately. The land is officially hers." Arabella let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, tears streaming down her face. Thank you both." The stranger nodded, but didn't smile. His expression remained grim, his eyes scanning the window, as if expecting Silas to burst through at any moment. "Don't thank me yet. Silas won't give up that easily. He'll come back with more men, with guns." As they left the land registry office, the sun was fully rising, casting long shadows across the town square. The stranger looked at Arabella and her father, then turned and walked away, without another word. But he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Silas Crane would be back, and when he did, the stranger would be ready. The sun was fully rising, as they stepped out of the land registry office, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Arabella clutched her father's arm, her knuckles white. The stranger stood apart, scanning the rooftops and doorways, his hand resting near his pistol. "He'll come back," the stranger said, his voice low. "Silas doesn't give up easily." "He won't get away with it this time," Doc Elmer replied, his voice steady for the first time in days. "Not with the deed authenticated and the territorial governor coming." The sheriff emerged from the office, a stack of papers in his hands. "It's all official now, Mrs. Blackwood. The land is yours. All of it." Arabella took the papers, her tears flowing freely now. "Thank you. I don't know how to." The stranger stepped forward. "You don't need to thank anyone. It's your land. Always was." He turned to the sheriff. "I need a copy of everything. Everything Silas forged, every bribe he made, every threat he issued. The governor needs to see it all." The sheriff nodded, disappearing back into the office. When he returned, he handed the stranger a thick envelope. "Everything you asked for, including Silas's confession about setting the fire to your field, Mrs. Blackwood." Arabella gasped. "He admitted that?" "He did," the stranger said. "And more." The town square was beginning to fill with people now, drawn by the commotion. They stood at a distance, watching silently as the scene unfolded. No one dared approach, but no one looked away either. "Word travels fast in a town like this," the stranger said, noticing the gathering crowd. "They know what happened. They know Silas is finished." Doc Elmer nodded. "This town has lived in fear for too long. Today, that changes." The sheriff returned with the final paperwork. "All signed and sealed. The deed is yours, Mrs. Blackwood. No one can take it from you now." Arabella took the document, her fingers trembling as she held it. "My land, my family's land." The stranger stepped forward, holding out his hand. "May I?" She nodded, handing him the deed. He examined it carefully under the bright morning sun, then turned to face the crowd that had gathered. "This land belongs to Arabella Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "It has always belonged to her family. Silas Crane tried to steal it through lies and threats, but he failed." He held up the deed for all to see. "This document proves the truth, and now justice has been served." The crowd erupted in cheers, but the stranger didn't wait to hear more. He turned to Arabella, handing her the deed. "Take care of your land," he said simply, "and your family." Arabella looked at him, tears still in her eyes, but a smile now on her face. "What about Silas? He'll come back." "He'll try," the stranger said, "but he'll find that the law is no longer in his pocket, and I'll be watching." With that, he turned and walked toward his horse, which was tethered at the edge of the square. He mounted in one fluid motion, his red bandana standing out against the morning sun. He looked back once at Arabella and her father, then turned his horse and rode west, disappearing into the distance. Arabella stood there, the deed clutched in her hands, watching as the stranger disappeared over the horizon. Her father put a hand on her shoulder. "He saved us," she said, her voice filled with awe. "He did," Doc Elmer replied. "And now we can rebuild what was taken from us." Together, they walked back toward her farm, the deed safe in Arabella's hands and hope in their hearts. The stranger was gone, but his justice remained. And in a town that had lived in fear for too long, That was more than enough. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.